is the Chief of Staff for the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. She earned her Master's of Divinity degree from Fuller Theological Seminary and a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Secondary Education from Vanderbilt University before she was ordained by the American Baptist Church USA. Janna joined the BJC in 2023 after working for more than a decade in the university context with graduate students and faculty members. And it now directs BJC's programs such as their fellowship program, their internship program, and their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. A proud daughter of immigrants, she founded the Coalition of Asian American Pacific Islander Churches, and she also has been acknowledged through grants and fellowships for her work in connecting Asian North American church communities, as well as supporting preaching practices all over the world. We are very grateful that the Reverend Janna Louie will share her experiences and her expertise with us today, particularly around how white Christian nationalism impacts religious freedom broadly, and as well as the potential harms towards other diverse communities of color. We welcome her remarks.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank Tahil, Tasneem, and Sable for the invitation to be here today, and also the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles for hosting this event. It's an important conversation that is going to take a long time to keep at this work, and it's very pressing today. So thank you so much for your labor of love and serving our communities in this way. As mentioned, I am a daughter of immigrants from Hong Kong. I say that because it locates what I do in the communities that are close to my heart. I've been asked today to talk a little bit about how white Christian nationalism has impacted communities of color. And I work, as was mentioned, for the Baptist Joint Committee. Thank you so much for the shout out for our initiative, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. What this means on a daily basis is I get news reports every morning from one of our staff who compiles all the news and social media posts that touch on Christian nationalism every morning. And there's books that I read, there's podcasts I listen to, there's data that I look at, but I wanted to start with a story that actually, that kind of brought it home to me, because it really hit all the different communities that I'm a part of and different realities that I hold. The work is heavy and it's difficult, but sometimes I realize I can't read that email, the news roundup every morning, because starting my day like that isn't the best way to go. Yes. So let me find a time and place to hone it in a little bit, even though it's everywhere and it is in our local communities and the larger picture. But I'll start with this story, and the story begins on May 3rd this year. This is just 2 months ago. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania, at a local commissioners meeting. So at this local meeting, there was an AAPI month, Asian American Pacific Islander Month, proclamation to celebrate the contributions of Asian American Pacific Islander community and to really acknowledge the history that's happened. So they talked just briefly about the first Asian American immigrants to Lancaster. And then they talked about recent Southeast Asian American immigrants and South Asian immigrants. They also recognized that it was just this past year that Lancaster County celebrated for the very first time Lunar New Year Festival, the Sakura Cherry Blossom Festival, Holi festivals, and Diwali celebrations. And so this proclamation was saying May is AAPI month, let's just celebrate it as a county together. Well, the story continues, because on May 24th, so 3 weeks later, at the local commissioners meeting, which is every Tuesday, they would open it up to public comments. Well, there were 3 public comments that were made at this meeting 3 weeks later. So just a note, I've transcribed some of these from watching the video. You can look at the full remarks online. I don't know if you really want to, but if you'd like to, you can Google it and find it, or I can send you the link. But I'm gonna just summarize some excerpts from these 3 comments, and I'm sure you can hear in them some resonant with Dr. Cooper-White's presentation and some of the elements that were just presented. So the very first comment comes from a white Christian lay person who came to make a public comment. And I know it's small, I hope you can see it later. And what he says is this: I would like to acknowledge, as the scripture says, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, and that I do in fact appreciate the variety of peoples and nations in the world. However, I must express my deep concern with a proclamation signed by all three commissioners and read during that May 3rd meeting. My concern lies in the offensiveness of that proclamation. It is offensive, number one, to the legacy of Mr. Hong Nak-woo, an Asian American we ought to respect, and far more importantly, it is offensive to the king of this county, the Lord Jesus Christ. This proclamation, amongst other things, amounted to the county commissioners officially recognizing the public good of Hindu religious celebrations. Furthermore, the proclamation revealed that your religious commitment, at least in public, is to pluralistic secular humanism. Namely, the three of you publicly proclaimed that multiple religious and pagan celebrations actually make our country stronger. This is an anti-Christian religious commitment. It is not neutral. It opposes the Christian worldview which teaches that all the gods of the nations are idols, Psalm 96:5. So briefly concerning Mr. Wu, he was a Christian minister who, upon returning to China, dedicated his life to ending heathen religious and pagan celebrations. I'm going to skip over a part where basically he quotes a journal entry of somebody talking about said Mr. Wu's Christian missionary work. This first comment ends by saying this: to use this man's name on a proclamation celebrating idolatrous religious festivals is a disservice to this great Asian American man. Second, and finally, this proclamation is offensive to the Lord Jesus Christ, to whom each of you and every one of us will one day give an account for our actions, including those done as civil leaders. Your duty, gentlemen, is to honor and publicly recognize Jesus Christ and govern according to his word. Therefore, I urge you, as one who finds himself under your governance, to publicly withdraw your celebration of idolatry in this country. And then he proceeds to quote Psalm 2, verses 10 to 11, and says, "Gentlemen, you are kindling the wrath of your rightful sovereign with proclamations like this. Please reconsider." I'll let you draw the connections, but I think for me, I was like, wow, a little bit pretty articulate from this person, of white Christian nationalism. And I think one piece I'll just note for me as an Asian American is Asian Americans are no stranger to being a wedge in our racial identitarian politics in this country. We saw that with Chinese laborers coming in the 1800s, and also last week with the Supreme Court case on affirmative action. But I do think it's particularly, I thought, oh, this is a new one, to use Asian Americans to then push back against an Asian American proclamation. That feels a little bit new, but the issue in itself of being a wedge and for us to be tossed aside to different which ways for whatever agendas people have, that's not new. But let me continue on. The second comment was made from a local pastor in the county, and this a little bit harder to transcribe, but these are some comments made from this white pastor. What we're up against in our modern culture is this question: are all cultures created equal? And I think most people would say no to that. Are some cultures better? In our modern situation, you're not allowed to say that. And then he goes on and says, he references James Michner's book, The Bridge at Andau, talking about the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And to conclude that story, he says, you would never convince those refugees that all religions or all cultures are created equal. They would never believe that, or that's why they're risking what they risk. He then proceeds to talk about the Christian missionary William Carey in the 1700s and attributes Carey's missionary work to ending a practice of widow burning. And then concluding that story, he says, so all cultures are not created equal. He continues to talk about religious studies and feminism in current university context as he sees it, and then says at the very end, all religions were definitely not created equal. In this country, well, when it comes to Hinduism, when we pledge allegiance to God. Hindu religions boast many gods. And one thing I just want to point out here, and I appreciate the comments of just specifically today talking about white Christian nationalism, but in some sense, I found it slightly ironic that a local pastor really leans into the white nationalism part in these remarks, right? I also thought, wow, this is a very compelling case to show people how Christian missions has been very much aligned with the colonizing effort around the world, because there's enormous assumptions that white Western cultures are one and the same as Christianity, or for those who profess a Christian faith, and also that this should be the dominant culture around the world, and so therefore our world would be better for it, right? You saw in the slide earlier a little bit about the city on the hill. That mentality is there. And second, I think the piece that stood out to me also was the reinterpretation of refugee experience. There are multiple refugee communities in the Asian American Pacific Islander communities. I won't speak for them, but I do think there's a dynamic here that's pretty painful to see white nationalism exploit the experience of refugee communities by reinterpreting it through the lens of power and control, and to assume what it was like for refugee communities to be and to migrate after reading a book. So I should continue on. This third and final comment comes from another just white Christian layperson in the area, and said this: the proclamation of AAPI Heritage Month. I have nothing against them or their culture, except for their pagan religion of Hinduism. In fact, last winter I enjoyed their food and socializing with them near Central Market where they were out there. The only paragraphs I have problems with this are celebrating Sakura Cherry Blossom Festival, these other Hindu religious cultures, the holy festivals, the Diwali celebrations, and also the line that Pastor Joel mentioned, and that is the commitment to create a more perfect union and advance our union's founding ideals of liberty and justice for all. But our whole nation's system of culture and morality is based on Judeo-Christian values that all come from the Bible. I think for me, this third piece, so the first one, I thought, wow, they did a really good job of combining white Christian nationalism. The second one leaned on white nationalism, and this one I thought just really went at Christian nationalism, which I do think they're all connected, but I see the leanings in this. Because there's this insistent and this incorrect assumption that the United States was founded upon Judeo-Christian values, and implying that the US is a Christian nation, right? This is a direct assault on the separation of church and state, and the founding principles for us for religious freedom. I think for me, there's also this added layer of dehumanization, where APIs are people where you can enjoy our food, our art, and our movies without dignifying the whole of our humanity. Right? Something that harkens back to the very first Asian American that was actually brought to the United States, Afang Moy, who was brought about as an exhibition traveling around the country so that people could consume her clothes, her body, and her language. So this is not new. With this, I'm going to skip over this briefly for the sake of time, but Dr. Jerry Park, and some of the research I think that Dr. Cooper-White refers to will be coming out in an article that Jerry Park, sociologist at Baylor, will be publishing. But one of the things that I'll just pull out from there is with, I think, one question that was asked earlier about how different communities of color have been brought in. Some of his research will be touching on that. And so what he did was to kind of separate out a little bit of white nationalism and Christian nationalism to see how different communities are responding to these different statements. And so that research is coming. But one thing that I'll just note from this research is that what he's seen, Dr. Park has seen, is that Christian nationalism is more accepted than white nationalism, specifically seen in racialized groups or communities of color, right, in these different statements. And this includes non-Christian religious groups or communities of color. So that is something I think to pay attention to, especially as we parse out what does it look like for us to engage and to respond and to combat growing Christian nationalism. So what happened in Lancaster, Pennsylvania? Well, with the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement that you saw, and I'll put up the website a little bit later, is we have signers from all congressional districts across our country, which I'm really grateful for. What we ended up doing is I had actually a contact in the AAPI community who reached out to me, showed me the recording of this commissioners meeting and said, hey, I know your organization is mobilizing Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I just wanted to let you know what was happening. So we reached out to our signers, which are about 50 signers in the Lancaster area, and we said, well, if they're making comments against an API month proclamation using Christian nationalism, are you willing to give counter comments at the next commissioners meeting, because they're open to the public? So while we reach out to that, we also wanted to make sure we took the lead of Asian American organizers who are most impacted, or who were most impacted by these remarks. And so at the same time, I reached out to local Asian American community organizers and saw, what are you doing? What are ways we can come alongside and support you all? Well, what this resulted in was a Zoom conversation, because clearly I'm in California, based in Southern California. Baptist Joint Committee is based in DC, but I was in a Zoom call with 2 Asian American community organizers, an older white clergy who's done a lot of work combating Christian nationalism, and also a lot of community organizing work through the years and through their life. But one of the dynamics that actually came to bear was that Asian American community organizers said, thank you so much. We can't believe that there's people outside of our area that care about our community. We're really grateful. And then our white clergy signer was saying, well, started asking questions, well, is it really strategic to show up at the next commissioners meeting? Fair question, and said, what does it look like to be more strategic? And recognizing, especially for older clergy, and I would say, as noted earlier, older white clergy, older black clergy have really done the work in our civil rights movement and know what it means to organize. And so these questions are fair. So they said, well, is there going to be media coming, all these different things? And I noticed, for me, I'm like holding different circles here, and I realized there's a little bit of hesitance from Asian American organizers. And basically, one of the issues that came up was Asian American organizers, actually, the local paper reached out to them, but they're hesitant because of the fear, because of safety and retaliation. It was our South Asian American community, of course, we're worried about if we say something and if we elevate this in the press, which is completely strategic from a community organizing standpoint, are worried, well, what happens after that? What happens to our communities? Does it make us more vulnerable? And obviously, this is pretty personal for me for many different reasons, but I think this final conversation, actually this Zoom meeting, impacted me, I would say, even more than these initial 3 comments when I looked at it. Those 3 comments for me were a little bit like the news articles, the news roundups that I see, but I think being in this room and seeing these are the complexities that we're dealing with as we think about what does it mean to push back against Christian nationalism. Because there's dynamics that we're holding, and in our communities, as we say, we're not that type, at least for me, I'm an ordained American Baptist minister and saying, oh, I'm not that kind of Christian. But there's still dynamics in the room as we figure out what does it mean to fight against Christian nationalism. And so I'll just share a couple lessons learned on my end. I think one of the first things that I reflected on as I thought about this situation was, one, white Christian nationalists are far better organized. They're very well organized, that's what I'll say. There's many books, Brad Onishi's Preparing for War, or different books I'm happy to recommend, that talk about the history that starts, I would say past 100 years, but very clearly in the last 60 to 100 years. They're organized enough to have 2 Christian lay people and 1 Christian pastor show up at a local commissioners meeting on a Tuesday morning. I mean, this is in the middle of a workday, to make comments against an AAPI month proclamation. That's what we're up against. They're organized. Their ideals might be destructive to our democracy and to our society, but they are motivated, they are strategic, and they are prepared. I think the second thing I thought a bit about is that, what does it look like for us to better, or for me to better understand power dynamics? Power dynamics in our societies, in our histories, and how do we locate ourselves a little bit better as we engage this work? I think a couple pieces that stood out to me in this Zoom conversation in particular is that I came in as an ordained Christian minister, and even if I don't identify with Christian nationalism, I'm still a Christian. And so in this spectrum of power, there is still power that I wield, especially as a Christian clergy. And then at the same time, I came in as an Asian American, holding many different communities with disaggregated realities coming in. And there isn't as much, or there's a difference in power that I wield that maybe I can feel the vulnerabilities, and I can feel the desire or the need to lean into survival. I think for our signer, who is a white Christian clergy, I would say, what does it look like to think about the power that is wielded, right? As a Christian clergy, as an academic, and also as a white person in this conversation. I understand the questions about strategy, but what is the appropriate question to ask as we're combating these very local realities coming up? And then for our Asian American community organizing partners, not identifying as Christians, they do have people power as they mobilize a lot of the local community, but at the same time feeling this was an assault to just a very brief proclamation to celebrate Asian American Month. It's not even that political, y'all. Like, it really isn't. But I wonder what power, they were coming in, I would argue, maybe with a little bit less power in the conversation with race and in terms of not identifying as a Christian. I think one final lesson I'll just draw out is that as I thought about this, I thought that, as I think about refugee and immigrant communities, survival is still resistance for the oppressed communities or communities that feel the vulnerabilities of the system. And I think that's something to be honored just as much as it is what does it look like to be strategic, to speak against powers, but we all do bring different things to the table. But as we come to the table together, what does it look like for us to evaluate appropriately the different power differentials that are in the room, our own power differentials, and then what does it look like for us to come together in coalition work? I'll stop there. There's more I could say, but thank you so much for at least engaging and listening to the story. I wonder, when I go from this place, the questions that I have is, what does it look like for us to let the most impacted lead us in this work? How do we dignify those with less power? And how do we listen well, even as we come into this work together? And finally, how do we build coalition and solidarity, even if it doesn't seem strategic? Because I do think, at least in this story and example, white Christian nationalism will hit a lot of different factors, and sometimes it might not seem like it's squarely fitting in the box that we see as white Christian nationalism, but what does it look like for us to build coalition and lean into things that might feel a little bit less familiar outside of our territory and let those with less power lead? I'll just highlight a couple pieces. Our Baptist Joint Committee's Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation is hosting a conversation called Disbelief, Reimagining the Religious Landscape of Black America, talking in particular about religious freedom for the Black community, engaging with those of faith and those that don't adhere to a faith in October. And if you're interested in connecting with us in the Christians Against Christian Nationalism movement, our signers are the main ways that as we listen and hear about what's happening locally, we'll contact signers and say, hey, are you willing to mobilize? Because this is happening in our areas. And of course, as many of you probably know, Orange County has a lot of things happening. There's a lot happening in SoCal. Brad Onishi's book talks a lot about the history there. But that is one way to connect. And we are really hoping as an organization to work with grassroots organizers and also be able to work on the state and federal levels as Christian nationalism hits that. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time.